Hi, welcome back, everyone. So now we are going to take up our last module for discussion, and let's see if we are able to finish this by 6:30. We'll not move on to the next session, and we'll rather continue in the same session, so that you can also take a longer break after the session. Okay. So in this session, we are going to take up issues arising out of design and implementation of various government policies and welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of the population. Now, if you look at this part, this talks about issues arising out of design and implementation of various government policies and schemes meant for vulnerable sections. And what we have done is we have already looked into two policies, that is your national health policy and national education policy. And you have understood what the basic framework of a policy is. Now, you have to remember that there can be two type of questions here. One, which will ask about a specific program, scheme, or policy of the government, that what are the issues with respect to this particular scheme or policy. And then there can be another one which is abstract, which talks about general issues related to program and implementation. The chances of question getting asked on a specific policy or scheme is more compared to the abstract one. But now when it comes to specific policies and programs and schemes of the government for vulnerable section, now this is something which has to be covered through your current affairs. As I had given you example with respect to your national health policy, with respect to your national education policy, that they ask questions on whatever is there in current affairs, whatever is there being discussed and debated in news, and they have already asked questions like that. Now this part where we talk about specific schemes and programs, if we take up the existing schemes and programs, it is not going to help you, to be very honest. Why? Because the question will be directed towards the dynamic part of it, where you would need need to quote specific issues related to that particular program. But what we can do is that we can take care of this abstract part. And also what I'll do is that we'll take up two of the vulnerable sections and try to analyze whatever government schemes and programs are there. Also, some of its part is covered with your polity syllabus, wherein you talk about various bodies, Commission for Women, Commission for SCs, STs, etc. So there as well, because that is also government intervention, and they are the ones who suggest what kind of schemes, policies, what are the issues, what can be the way forward, etc. So those things are covered there. Here, what we are going to do is we are going to take care of this abstract part. That means we'll talk about how generally a policy framework looks like and what are the issues at various stages of policy formulation and execution. Because first, a policy is designed, then it is executed, implemented, and then it is also evaluated through its life cycle. Because from that evaluation, they can move on to next policy or program. So, for instance, they open up health and wellness centers across the country, say in rural areas. But this see, after evaluation, after careful evaluation, they find out that the outcome was not perfect. That the outcome was sorry, that the outcome was not something that they had expected. So what do? They try to figure out what are the problems or what were the problems at various stages of that particular initiative, and accordingly they'll make improvements in the next program or scheme. So there can be issues related to design of that particular scheme or policy, and then there can be issues which arise out of implementation of that program. But generally you find that the problems are found on the implementation stage, that they are not able to implement properly, that there is corruption in the system, that the state government and the central government are not working in coordination, that the funding is not, or the funds are not being released in time. These are the kind of implementation problems that you face on a regular basis. And again, you remember, if they ask a specific question, you'll need a specific answer, which has to come from your current affairs. But if there is because there is another possibility that you're not aware of that particular scheme, the chances are very less, because they'll take up only the popular ones. But if you're not aware, at least you'll know the general principles which can be applied there, right? So let's start with the first part, that is issues arising out of design and implementation, and post this we'll take up two vulnerable sections and a few questions and conclude the session. Okay, so you can get the PPT link after the class. I think there is some problem or some technical issue with the portal, and a lot of students are asking for the same, that somehow it is not reflecting. The PPT is not reflecting on the portal, but do not worry. During the break, I'll just inform them to get it fixed by the technical team. Okay. Now, before we move into it, just look at this basic framework, and let's look at this in the light of your national health policy that we have already discussed, because it will be easier for you to connect. So the first thing is that why at all you need the policy, and what are the specific objectives and demands of that policy. So to understand what is the need of the policy, you basically take up the background, that you see what is happening, what is the status of healthcare industry, what is the status of healthcare in India. From this report, from this background, you'll try to highlight what are the issues, and these are the objectives that we want to achieve. So if you remember, if you remember that the objective of our national health policy was basically about outcome, so that everyone, every individual in our country is able to get quality and affordable healthcare, is getting access to quality and affordable healthcare, and which we said is basically an equivalent of universal health coverage. And there we were saying that universal health coverage is the objective that we have to achieve, that we provide access to affordable and quality healthcare services, right? If you remember from yesterday's discussion. Now, this is the basic objective which has to be achieved through this policy. So first thing is that they figured out what is the need, or what is the demand, or what is the objective of this particular policy. Now, what they'll do is they to achieve these objectives, they'll have certain inputs, that okay, let's increase expenditure, or let's increase public expenditure on health. Let government put in money in healthcare sector to improve on all these aspects. Or they can talk about, let's go with the private sector, they can talk about digitization, etc. So there can be various forms of input where it comes to the particular policy. Then with these inputs, you start the process. For instance, the government is putting in money in healthcare, and they are opening up health and wellness centers. Now, these health and wellness centers will ensure that you get universal health coverage, because these health and wellness centers will be available across the length and breadth of the country, so that there is access to everyone. These healthcare centers, health and wellness centers, will ensure that everyone gets affordable and quality healthcare, so that the output is achieved. But now, the output does not guarantee outcome. The output does not guarantee outcome, because outcome is basically the impact on the targeted group. In this case, whether the health indicators of people are getting better or not, that is going to be our output, or that is going to be our outcome. So the outcome, if you remember directly from the objective, that better quality of life has to be achieved for people living in this country. So this is the basic process, that there has to be an objective of the policy. There has to be an objective of the policy, which has to be achieved through so and so means. What is going to be the process? This process is basically the implementation phase. In the implementation phase, they will figure out that how are we going to use this money, use this input of public expenditure. With that, they achieve the desired output, that is universal health coverage. And again, this universal health coverage, that is the output, will try to ensure that we achieve the outcome as well, that is better quality of life for people. So I hope these ideas are clear, these words, these terms are clear. You do not have to remember, because it is actually a fairly simple process that you can derive logically as well. Yes, I'm going to use yellow color itself. So on the white part, yellow is not visible, that's why I was using red. Okay, now let's look at these three stages in the policy process. The first phase is your design phase. It starts with design, that you finalize that this is the policy, this is how we are going to go about it. Second phase is your implementation phase. And finally, you have to evaluate what you did. Because ultimately, even in governance, you read, if there is no feedback mechanism, how would you know what is the outcome? And we were saying that uh, the progresses or the successes that our national health policy has been able to achieve will reflect in the outcome. That is, when we take up survey later, or when we do the thorough census exercise, we'll be able to figure out what are the health indicators, whether they have improved compared to this compared to pre-policy levels or not. So that is what evaluation. Now, at the first stage, I'll just briefly tell you about these, and then we'll come to all these processes, all these stages one by one. Now, the first thing is that you have to identify the problem. Now, can someone here tell me, how do you identify the problem? How do you identify the problem? Because if you are, say, designing a policy for betterment of your transgenders, we're designing a policy for betterment of women, we're designing a policy for a better healthcare sector, the first stage is that we have to identify the problems so that this policy framework can fix those problems. So yes, background of the policy. To prepare the background, what you have to do is you have to take up various reports. You have to take up data. So data is the most crucial thing. Now this data can come from sample surveys. This data can come from census. This data can come from any other, say, NGOs. This data can come from international bodies, etc. That there has to be a comprehensive data into which we can look and we can figure out that, okay, the infant mortality rate in India is so high and we have to fix this. Similarly, you can say that the out-of-pocket expenditure has increased multifold. Let's fix this. The doctor and patient ratio is very less. Let's improve it. So the first stage is that you have to identify the problem using data. Then you move on to determining the objectives. You identify the problem and then you say that these are the objectives that we have to fulfill. The way in which we have proceeded with health, with education, you have seen that the policy itself is talking about various issues related to healthcare, various issues related to education. These policies are also taking from various other reports by your NGOs like Pratham, from your All India Survey on Higher Education by Ministry of Education. So all these, the data that is being used will identify all the problems. On the basis of these problems, we will determine the objectives. Now, once the objectives have been determined, that yes, we have to achieve universal health coverage, then we have to start figuring out what are the ways in which we can achieve this objective. Because ultimately, the point of going with this policy is to achieve these objectives. To achieve these objectives, there can be various alternatives. So, for example, to achieve universal health coverage, you can push traditional medicine. To achieve universal health coverage, the government can invest more in health. To achieve universal health coverage, the private sector can also play a part. So, there can be various options. In this way, you have to look into various policy alternatives, that these are, say, 3-4 ways in which we can achieve the objective. Now, then what you do is you have to finalize, you have to evaluate each and every alternative, and then finalize that this is my way in which I'm going to proceed. So A is public expenditure, B is privatization, C is digitization, D is traditional medicine. So what you do is you basically again use data. You say that if we increase public expenditure on health, what is going to be the outcome? Similarly, if we increase the number of private hospitals, what is going to be the outcome? Now, again, for the analysis of these alternatives, for the evaluation of these alternatives, we are again going to use data that we had in the previous policy. According to the previous policy, we increased the percentage of our, say, GDP, which goes in public health to 1% or by 1%. And what were the outcomes? So you have to basically evaluate all these policy alternatives. Then finally, you will take a call that, okay, let's go with a mix of A plus B plus C plus D in different proportions. Let's increase public expenditure on health by, say, 1%. Let's try to privatize more and increase by 20%. Now, these objectives that they had chosen could be quantifiable as well. In the case of national education policy, you have seen that they are talking about achieving gross enrollment ratio, 100% gross enrollment ratio by 2030. So they can be quantifiable and they can be very abstract. As in the case of education itself, you would have seen that how ideal and how theoretical those things sound. So they can be quantifiable or they can be abstract. So to achieve those objectives, we are going to decide on a particular policy alternative. That this is the policy alternative that we are going to choose. Then the next stage is final selection of the policy. So out of these alternatives, so say A meant 20% of public expenditure, 30% of privatization, 40% of digitization, and maybe 10% of traditional medicine. Say this was what A is, and they go with A. This is the final policy that we are going to proceed with. At this stage, the policy is finalized. It'll be taken up for discussion amongst your legislators. It is going to get approved, finalized, and now this is the policy framework which has to be used. So the objectives will remain the same, the alternatives will remain the same. All you can change is during the implementation process. Now the policy is finalized and you have to start implementing the policy. So you implement it in various phases. As you have already seen that it always happens in phases, because there'll be multiple objectives which we have to achieve. And then also it will involve a lot of programs, etc. So it will happen in a phase wise manner and the implementation process is started. Now, during implementation, you have to consistently monitor that, okay, we are investing in, say, vaccination programs. Is it bearing any fruit or not? What are the numbers? Whether the implementation is proper or not, whether every state is opening up these health and wellness centers or not, and if there is a shortfall, if there is a particular state which is lagging behind, they would have to figure out during this stage itself that how can we fix that problem. This is the basic of implementation, and implementation and monitoring go hand in hand. This monitoring happens throughout the phase of implementation. Always remember, monitoring happens throughout the phase of implementation only. Then the next part is evaluation, that you have to evaluate the entire policy, whether it was successful or not, whether the objectives were fulfilled or not, whether we were able to achieve the objectives or not. And this evaluation takes into account the outputs, the outcomes of the policy, and also whether there was an issue at the design level, at the implementation level. This evaluation is basically evaluation of the entire process, whereas monitoring is only limited to implementation phase. Again, you do not have to remember this. I'm just telling you because if you go through it once or twice, because you would have to revise and it'll become by hearted, but you do not have to remember it as such. So this monitoring happens during the implementation phase, that what are the problems with implementation, whether the funds are getting released in time or not, is there any component of corruption, is there any other malpractice that we can fix, is there a particular program which is faring well, so that they can learn lessons from that and they can make changes accordingly. Because you cannot make changes once the design is finalized and the policy has been selected. You can only make changes to the implementation part. Now this evaluation will look into the outcome, that this was the say group, targeted group, that we were trying to achieve women empowerment in the field of politics, say political empowerment of women. Now this is the targeted group, and you will look at the outcome, that yes, you had invested a lot, yes, you had provided with reservation, but what was the actual outcome? What was the impact of those changes? What was the impact of those investments on the targeted group? That is what outcome is. So you look at the outcome, and you also evaluate the entire policy, all the phases of this policy process. Now this is the basic of your policy process. These are the various stages. Now what we'll do is, we'll take up all these stages one by one and try to identify what kind of problems can we face at each stage. And I'm going to need your help in identifying those problems, those issues, because this is basically the framework using which you can analyze anything. Because you'll get the ground rules, you would know that okay, this is one aspect where I have to look into, this can be about data, this can be about implementation, etc. Okay. Yes, so we also have to check resource availability in implementation. During the implementation stage, you have to check whether the human resources are skilled or not. If they're not skilled, you have to skill them. So there has to be continuous, consistent capacity building, etc. And we'll come to that part. Do not worry. Now, along with this, you have to remember one more thing, which is policy analysis. Now, policy analysis is the technique that they use for the entire process. So this policy analysis is a data-based technique. Now they'll use data for estimating and measuring the consequences of public policy. Now this involves two things. This involves that what will be the likely consequences of proposed policy. That if we go with this policy alternative, what are going to be its consequences? So they are trying to look into the future with this data. Also, what they'll do is that in the past we had used this, or maybe for this policy we have used these programs. What is the actual outcome? What are the consequences of that? So they are looking also into the past and the present. So this policy analysis basically takes up data from the past, analyzes it, that what were the outcomes, because there can be a few programs which were redundant, they did not yield any result, the outcome was not good. So they will try to analyze the past, then they'll look at what are the consequences of the policy which has been already adopted, and they are going to look into the future as well, that if we go with this policy alternative, or if we take up this program, what are going to be the likely consequences of the same. This is what the idea of policy analysis is, and then again, this is happening throughout the process. Now the first part is identifying the underlying problem and determining the objective. We know that if we figure out what are the problems, we ultimately know what are going to be our objectives. Now at this stage, what can be the problem that we can face? To identify the problem. And also remember, just to give you a hint, that we use data for identifying the problem. So what can be the problems at this stage of identifying and determining objectives of the policy? Please suggest. No, what can be the problems? What can be the problems at this stage when we are trying to identify? Okay, so the data can be inadequate. The data might not be present for a few indicators. Then the way, okay, please suggest. Great. Another thing is reliability of the data. That the data that you are using, maybe it is coming from a sample survey like the one that has been used for Global Hunger Index, that they are asking a group of 3,000 people a few questions, and basis that they are saying whether they are malnourished or not. So this data can be can have a problem with reliability. Then also you'll find that various departments and various surveys of the government, they give out different data, so which can also be a problem, that there can be difference in data from various sources, that the data is not consistent. That is consistency of the data. The data is not consistent. Great. So the accuracy and reliability, they go hand in hand, whether the data is reliable or not, because your accuracy would determine whether the data is reliable or not. And also at this stage, when you're trying to identify the problem, someone had written that the data is misleading. Rather than writing that the data is misleading, we can say the way in which we analyze data can be a problem, that we are not able to identify the problems correctly looking at the data, which can also become a problem. Yes, so the interpretation of the data, the analysis of the data can also be a problem. Now, at this stage, this is the first stage, very first stage. If you identify the problems as wrong, then what is going to happen? The design of the entire policy is going to be flawed. Why? Because you have not identified the right problems. So these are the problems at the first level. How do you fix these? Take care of data. Fix all these issues with data, and you are there. So whatever the problems, you have concurrent solutions. No, Jen, that is next stage. The stage we are talking about is this one. Now, basis this data, we have identified problems. We have uh, mentioned, or we have identified our objectives as well. Now, what happens is, to achieve those objectives, we have to take up various policy alternatives. Now, what can be the problems at this stage? What can be the problems at this stage? That when you have to determine the policy alternative and evaluate various policy alternative, what can be the problems? No. Right now, it is not a matter of fund. We have not come down to the say implementation part. Right now, we are still trying to figure out which way to take. Just think about this. The ones who are evaluating and selecting, you can take the stage as one, or you can consider it has three subparts: that evaluating, determining, and policy selection. To say that the people who are actually determining these policy alternatives, again, to determine these policy alternatives, you'll need data, and the data will have same problems as in the previous stage. That is one. The second part is that these policy alternatives, or the final ultimate policy selection that they are going to take up, is going to reflect what they think about, or what is their ideological bias. Because the people who are working on this data evaluation and finally selecting your say desirable policy alternative, they can have ideological bias. Some of them might think that rather than looking at data, they might think, and they might have this preconceived notion, that privatization is something which is better. Privatization is something which will be the best way to achieve policy alternative, to achieve the objectives of the policy. So basically, their ideological bias can reflect in this entire process. Then the second part is, if there are multiple stakeholders and ultimately it is being taken up by a group of experts, right? Your bureaucrats for that matter. Yes, they can also involve other stakeholders. They can ask other experts to join. Then also there can be a problem or related to conflict between this amongst this group, that everyone feels that a different alternative is better. Some feel that traditional medicine is better. Some feel that your uh, public health expenditure, increasing public health expenditure is better. Everyone has a different thought process, and it might not be coming directly from data, but maybe it is on the basis of their ideological bias. Now, on the basis of this, because we are using this process to determine policy alternative, and the policy that we select, if it is going to reflect the ideological bias of those people, to think again, there is a flaw in design, that rather than relying on data, rather than using database techniques, you went with your ideological bias. This is a problem. Sneha, please be careful that when you say that they might not be skilled enough, it is better not to mention things such as those. You can mention these things during the implementation phase, because here the ones who are actually working in policy analysis, they are experts in their field. So they know the ways, they know how to go about something, they know how to choose policy alternatives. And for that matter, you would find that all the policies that we have, even if you look at the recent policies, everything is up to the mark. So when it comes to the design part, you would not generally you would not find a lot of problems. The problems that you'll find at design stage are generally coming from data part. That the technique is not the problem, but the reliability of data becomes a problem. The two different sources of the government say that this is the case and this is the case. They have opposite viewpoints. What can you do? Which data do you rely on? Yes, there can be complications. So for that matter, we are talking about the complexity of this process and how it becomes a challenge. I have written all these things. Do not worry about it. I've written all these things. And whatever I have not written, I'm mentioning it on the sides. So, yes, you can definitely talk about the complexity of this entire process. Because ultimately, we are choosing a course of action. And this course of action that we go with is going to be there for next 25, 30 years at least 20 years. You see, when was your last education policy? And look at now. After so many years, we have our next education policy. So the last policy for your elderly, when was it? What is the time now? So you see that the policy choice that we are going to take up, the policy alternative that we are going to choose, is going to remain there for a long time. So we have to be very careful when it comes to the design part. And that's why we were saying that this is the consequence of your delayed census. Because if we have census data, we know we have reliable data now, and basis this data, we can take decisions. Okay. Now we have finally selected the policy and we go ahead with implementation. Now, Ragini has also highlighted that on the basis of this data, the policy alternative that we choose might not be region specific or might not be specific to a country. That, okay, looking at data, they have finalized this policy alternative, but that might not fit in very well when it comes to the state of, say, Bihar, or it might not fit very well when it comes to the state of Kerala. But again, you have to remember that the data that we use already covers all the regions. And again, the implementation, during the implementation stage, those changes are made. So there'll be a few states who already have better indicators when it comes to maternal mortality rate. Then obviously they would invest less in those states. But this policy framework is meant for the entire country. And I can understand the ideas that you're having, because it is obviously very hard to govern a country of the size of India and the population of our scale. It becomes a problem with a lot of regional disparity in all the indicators. It becomes a problem, but this problem has to be taken care of at implementation level. And also, uh, on the basis of your observation, you'll find that I have included a question towards the end of the chapter. Towards the end of the discussion, we are going to take up that question on regional disparities and what happens in case of centrally sponsored schemes. Now, we are moving on to the next stage, that is policy implementation. Now, you had that question in health, which said a policy is as good as its implementation. That means it is impossible to make a policy succeed if the implementation is not proper. You might know everything about the civil services examination. You might have understood the syllabus well, but if you are not able to write answers, then the entire purpose is defeated. That means there's a problem at the implementation level. You have all the knowledge, you have all the understanding, but you are not able to put your views across, put the ideas across. That means you have failed at the implementation stage. Now let's look at a few uh, basic minimum requirements to implement a policy. Now, one thing is that you are going to need financial and human resources. Then also, you should have a plan and support from various departments and various wings of the government. So the first thing is that you need to have adequate financial and human resources to implement any policy, because you'll need people. If you want to create toilets across rural India, you'll need a lot of money for that. You'll need a lot of people who will be working in constructing those toilets. You'll need a lot of people who are going to survey the areas and figure out which are the households, or identify the households which actually need a toilet. So you'll need a lot of manpower and financial resources to implement any policy. Then also, there has to be administrative capability, that you should be skilled enough. The question that you had raised, Sneha, is being answered here, that your administration need to have the capacity to implement the policy. If they do not have the requisite skills, ultimately the implementation is going to fail. Then you also need support from all the three wings of the government. Why? Because the policy is decided, this is the policy framework. What if there is a lot of judicial intervention every now and then? What if the executive is not supportive and they are not giving funds in time? They're not helping you in, say, fast tracking the process. So you ultimately need support from all the wings of the government. What if there is a new law which prohibits you from taking care of your roles and responsibilities? What if you get transferred every now and then? Because this implementation comes down to your district level administrators. They are the ones responsible for implementing these policies and programs at the grassroots level. So what if they get, say, transferred frequently? So all the wings of the government need to be there, need to be helpful, need to be supportive to implement a policy properly. The next part is that what are the conditions for success? When do you say that a policy implementation was successful? Now, the first idea is that whether the desired outcomes and objectives have been achieved or not. This is the idea of ultimate success of a particular policy. Now, to make that happen, you need a few conditions to be there. The first one is the basic thing that we have already discussed, that you need so and so resources, you need support from the government. Apart from that, you have to see that your target group accepts whatever policy you are providing. That, for instance, this uh, program the policy for your transgenders, wherein they can identify their gender themselves. This is related to gender identification, has a lot of problems. We are going to look into a few of those problems just to give you a glimpse how it goes. But the thing is, the targeted group itself is not per se accepting whatever changes you are bringing about. So you have to make sure that the targeted group gets involved, because without public participation, without them agreeing, without them understanding, nothing is going to happen. Then these programs which have to be implemented, because within this policy there'll be multiple programs which have to be implemented. If the directives are not clear, if the structure of the implementation process is not clear, then ultimately the performance is going to suffer. Similarly, the leaders of these implementation agencies should have the requisite skills, as we have already discussed. So when we say you need human resources, you need skilled human resources, you need sincere, dedicated, honest human resources, because this can ultimately lead to corruption as well, because they, whatever they can do now is at the implementation stage. And these changes or any kind of corrupt or malpractices at the phase of implementation is going to become problematic for the policy as a whole. Now, they should be actively supported by organized groups. Then also, throughout the implementation process, the judiciary has to be supportive or neutral, because ultimately they can, with their judicial activism or rather judicial adventurism, they can simply become a problem or become the red tape in this implementation process. Then then also we have to see that whatever priority we give to statutory objectives that we have already decided in the policy framework, they should not get undermined during the say implementation phase. That you had to achieve the objective A, you started with in the direction of achieving the objective A, but you somehow changed the direction and started going towards B. That means you got derailed in the process. You were not able to focus on the objective. You were not going behind the objective. Rather, there was a problem. Yes, so as already discussed, Neha, we need support of people, not just your target group, but community participation at large. And again, this problem can be fixed. I'll tell you. Now, this problem of people not being supportive or the targeted group not being, say, neutral or supportive of the policy, this problems comes when you do not consult the stakeholders. Can anyone sitting here give me an example of the same? Because from the recent past, we have a brilliant example wherein the stakeholders were not consulted and ultimately they came out in protest. Can anyone suggest this? Because community participation is later, but ultimately you need to consult the stakeholders. You need to consult the targeted group. Is it something that you want or not? Yes. So basically, your three legislations, which were meant for the farmers, and we saw a widespread protest against those three laws. And ultimately, the government had to take it back. Why? Because there was no stakeholder consultation. So you have to always keep the stakeholders in loop throughout the process. It should not happen, because your policies should reflect will of the people. These policies should not come top down, rather they should be bottom up. Their implementation and their design should be a bottom up process. We are not saying you ask everyone, you take a vote whether we should go with this policy alternative or not. No, but you consult the stakeholders that what are your problems. And if say your declining income is your problem, how do you want to fix it? So take views. You keep it open. So yes, you see that government keeps it open for public comments, but again it can be questioned whether those public comments etc are being included or are being used in the policy or not. So you're not able to explain the to understand the last point of conditions for success. So the last point for conditions for success was saying that we were supposed to be set out to achieve the objective A. This is your objective A. We were going in this direction, but during the implementation phase, there is a possibility that we stray away from objective A and somehow start moving in the direction of B, which should not happen, because ideally we were set out to achieve the objective A and we should move in that direction. That we should not lose the sight of our objective, right? That's what we say. So when you started your preparation, what do your parents say? Just do not lose your objective. Do not lose the sight of your objective. You should know that you were set out to clear the examination. Now, no matter what, you have to keep moving in the right direction. Keep moving in the same direction. So you should not lose sight of the objectives. That is what the last point meant. So I hope the idea is clear now. Now, we have already seen that the conditions for success can be understood as issues, because if those conditions for success are not met, ultimately there'll be issues with implementation. So what you have to do is you take up those conditions for success and you say that if the targeted group, if the stakeholders are not consulted, there can be problems related to implementation, because once you start implementing it, you can you might face a widespread protest. Similarly, if the if your administrators are not skilled, if you do not have adequate financial and human resources, it can become a problem. So all those things which are required for the successful implementation of a policy can be mentioned as issues, that if we are not able to make up for those things, these will become issues. So now you see that when it comes to implementation, you know the basic framework, that what is required, and if those requirements are not met, then ultimately we will not be able to implement that policy well. That is what the basic idea is. Moving on to the next stage, that is within the implementation process, that we go on monitoring it throughout the implementation. While we are implementing a policy, we have to keep monitoring whether whether the implementation is going in the right direction or not, whether there are problems. So if there is no one to monitor, who will figure out that the people we had assigned the task are not skilled, they are not able to fulfill their duties, their responsibilities? So this monitoring aspect will also maintain transparency in the system and fix the accountability of various stakeholders at every stage. Now, this objective of policy monitoring is to ensure that through the policy implementation process, resource inputs are used efficiently to yield the intended results. So we were saying that during the implementation phase, we might lose the sight of the objective. This monitoring can fix it. During implementation process, you might find a shortfall of human resources. Monitoring can fix it. Because if you do not monitor, if you do not look into the implementation phase, if there is no feedback mechanism, ultimately you would not be able to figure out what are the problems. And if you do it properly now, yes, this policy is going to succeed, but you will have lessons for implementing other policies as well, right? So this policy monitoring is also important. Now, what can be the problems related or issues related to policy monitoring? Now, what if the ones who are implementing are the ones who are monitoring it? Have you ever seen any government saying that this is a program that we are implementing and there are problems with it? And the answer is no. No one would want to put the blame on themselves. Also, at times you find that just to fast track the process, they skip this stage altogether. They do not monitor at all. Also, during the design itself, they have not included the component of monitoring. They did not account for monitoring for that matter. So what has to be done? That the people or the ones who are executing or implementing the policies and programs, they should not be the ones who are monitoring. There has to be an independent body which doesn't take directions from the government, which doesn't give in to the pressure of the government, and they do it in a very fair manner. But again, you know this is very theoretical, very ideal, which is not possible. Ultimately, you find that it is the government which takes the call on this, which takes a call on this, and no government would go on identifying its own problems, that we are not able to implement this well. So no matter how disastrous the implementation of a policy be, they would never say that there was a problem on our end. They would put the blame on stakeholders, they would put the blame on opposition, that they were creating ruckus, they were creating problems. They would put the blame on someone else, maybe on some other social group, but they would never say that it was because of lack of expertise, etc., that this implementation of policy failed. Okay, so I hope these ideas are clear now, because there is a little repetition, but you have to be aware that how you have to go about it. Now we move on to the evaluation phase. To evaluate, the first thing that you need is policy outcome. So you have understood this well. We given inputs with which we start creating new infrastructure, we start imparting skills, etc. We basically start implementation. Now we have to see that whatever outputs we got using the inputs, are they yielding any result? Are they actually making the quality of life of people better? If we are saying that that the quality of our education has to be top notch, and we have to bring in social transformation, make people aware about their constitutional duties and responsibilities as citizen, how do you find that? You look at the targeted group. What kind of changes do you see in the targeted group? So this is basically policy outcome. And I have also given a few examples. When you go through it during revision, I have also given a few examples from here and there, which will give you a clear idea that what these stages mean. Now let's move on to the last part, which is evaluation. But it is also one of the most important part. Now this is also done using that same database technique, and you basically evaluate everything related to policy. Everything that you have to assess the overall quality, effectiveness, efficiency of the entire policy framework. This is what you have to do when you take a policy evaluation, because this policy evaluation will basically become the background for the new policy. Right? We were saying in data analysis, in policy analysis, we take up data, we look into the past, we look into the future. Now this will give you that starting point for the next policy. That looking at this data, that okay, we had gone with this policy alternative, but it did not yield any result. There were issues related to design itself. The data was not proper, etc. So this policy evaluation is also very important. Now this policy evaluation considers the outcome of the policy. That you have to remember. It is not just about whether a policy has been successfully implemented or not. You can implement a policy in the best way possible, but still it would not say yield desired outcome. If the quality of life of people is not getting better, which was say the objective of the policy, no matter how good the design was, how better the implementation was, if you are not getting the desired outcome, then it is all a moot point. It is all a problem. So you have to remember that the policy process, various stages of policy, do not end at implementation phase. You have to look into the outcomes. Then looking at those outcomes, you are going to evaluate the overall performance of the policy, and which will become the background for your newer policy. They do. Jayant is saying that why don't they run pilot projects before implementing? Yes, they do. So whichever policy they start implementing, they start it on a pilot basis in a few regions, in a few districts, in a few states, so that they see before putting in all the money. It is like your clinical trials that we were talking about yesterday. It is like your clinical trials. So let's test it on a small sample size before we make it available for the masses. Right? That's what they do. They do that. So Aditya is asking whether do we study tribes in social justice. When it comes to tribals, one, you can consider them as a part of paper 2. The reason is that they are there in your polity paper. Then they are also part of the vulnerable sections that we take up in social justice. But also you can find a question in paper 1. Why? Because they are also tribal diversity is also one of the salient features of Indian society, and you already have a question on tribals in paper 1. So yes, it is important for both paper 1 and 2 perspective. Now, this was all about the policy process. So what we have done is we looked at the policy process. What is the process of design? What is the process of implementation? What is this evaluation? And at each and every stage, we try to highlight the problems that are there. Now, ultimately, you have this way forward that whatever problems were there, this can fix it. We did not consult stakeholders. You have to go with bottom to top approach, bottom up approach, that you consult the stakeholders, you find out on the grassroots level what are the problems, and then you start with designing your policy. Use flexible components in planning. That means do not be very rigid. Do not say that either this way or the highway. No, there should be a component of flexibility in planning, that if not this, maybe we can switch. If this is not giving desired outcomes after, say, 100 days of implementation, we might shift to the other alternative rather than sticking to the same policy. Then you also have to take care of the dynamics that are happening, because the society is undergoing changes. There is social change taking place every day, so you have to take that in account as well. Okay, so that's not written, so you can write, you have to take in account the dynamics of the society as well, because we are undergoing demographic change. Because of that demographic change, we are also undergoing social change, right? So that your policy does not become redundant. Then you have to increase the role of civil society, because as already discussed, the civil society is going to help us with both design and implementation of the policy, and I don't think we need to expand on this more, as we have already discussed. Then there has to be capacity building, because we were saying at times you do not have sufficient human resources, skilled human resources, who can take up the implementation. So there has to be capacity building. Now this capacity building has to be at the level of data analysis as well. So if you think about capacity building, it extends to various methods in which you collect data, the role of technology, etc. Then the stakeholders have to be made aware, because at times the policy is good, but the stakeholders do not get to know that so and so policy exists. So they have to be made awareness. There have to be widespread awareness programs. Now, to spread awareness, you can use media. To spread awareness, you can use civil society. There are various ways to spread awareness, but the idea is that there should be stakeholder awareness and participation as well, because without their participation, ultimately it would not yield the desired results. If you want to make the quality of life of transgenders better, you have to involve people from within that community. There has to be participation from that community, because they are the ones who understand their issues, their challenges better. Then you have to give autonomy to various states. So someone was saying that there is a problem when it comes to the regional disparities across the country, that different states have different challenges, and hence they need different suggestions or different ways to tackle those problems. But what generally we find is that we have this top down approach, wherein the policy is being forced over all the states in a similar fashion. It is uniform throughout the country, and we know that any kind of uniformity is not going to help India. Why? Because it is diverse. Why? Because people have different preferences. Why? Because people have different challenges. So you have to give more autonomy to states as to how they want to use that fund. And what we have done is, on this particular aspect, that too specifically in context of centrally sponsored scheme, I've given a question and its answer as well towards the end of this chapter. So which is basically, you just have to go through it. We'll discuss the question. Then you learn lessons from past. Do not repeat the same mistake. Again, they're talking about making your data analysis techniques more refined. Then the evaluation and monitoring that is being carried out, it has to be by an independent body, because ultimately, if you ask the same person, if you ask me, how well did you teach, what would I say? It was good, right? If you are, if the one who is taking it up should not be the one who is evaluating it. The basic idea of separation of powers, right? What was the idea in your monarchical structure? That there was a king and the court. They were the ones who will make laws. They were the ones who will execute laws, and they were the ones who will take care of imparting justice as well. So would they say that our own law, that the law that we have made, is problematic? No, because in their, they have done it in their right mind, that this is something that we need, and let's go ahead with this law. So these are various way forwards, and I don't think you actually needed this part, because you have understood the way forward with the problems and challenges itself. Now please tell me if this part was clear. Please tell me if this part was clear, the entire policy framework, because this is the framework that you have to use to understand the questions that are there in the examination, because as I have already shown you that they ask questions specifically about design, specifically about implementation, and if you do not understand the policy process, you would not be able to answer those questions, even if you have gone through the exact answer through the newspapers. So this was for your conceptual clarity, and in case there is a bouncer, let's try hitting it, right? Let's try touching it somehow. Let's not duck on every bouncer. Okay, perfect. Now there is a practice question. Look at this question. Highlight the challenges in implementing gender sensitive policies in India. So we are talking about policies, particularly gender sensitive policies, and we are talking about challenges. What can be the challenges in implementing gender sensitive policy? Now the first thing that we know about this question is, yes, there can be challenges related to implementation, but there can be challenges on design level as well. So this design part gives us a brief introduction or a conclusion, right? It can give you a brief introduction or conclusion, and better to use this in introduction. Why? Because we see that in the body part we have to talk about the challenges related to implementation of gender sensitive policy. So if you have challenges in the body, in the conclusion you basically talk about the solution to the same or the way forward. So simple question, highlight the challenges in implementing gender sensitive policies in India. And I believe in the year 23 they have asked a question to similar effect. I'm not sure, but I think they have asked a similar question. Okay, so you know the introduction. There can be other forms of introduction. Your introduction can also start with any kind of example that you have from your recent current affairs relating to a gender sensitive policy. Then also when you say gender, make sure when you write the body part, you also mention something about the third gender as well. It is not about, it's not only about women, it is also about third gender. So maybe you can use an example for that matter. Then in the conclusion you have to come up with a way forward, that whatever challenges we face in implementing these gender sensitive policies, we come up with a solution here. Now when you go to the body part, whatever points you are writing, discrimination against women, the patriarchal setup, etc., can be mentioned here. Now the ones who are working, you see that there is inequality when it comes to matters of employment, and you'll find more often than not it is a male member who is at the top, and they might be very insensitive to issues related to women or issues related to transgenders. Then also the gender inclusion part is a problem. So there can be various biases on various levels. Then apart from this, there can be problems that we have already highlighted. They are talking about implementation of gender sensitive policies. So there can be the majority of the component, say 80%, goes to gender specific problems, and then you can give a small paragraph to other issues related to implementation, right? You can give you can just dedicate one paragraph to other issues related to implementation of a particular policy, because those will also become a challenge in implementing these policy. All you have to do is you just have to give them a flavor of gender sensitivity, right? You would say that we know that there can be a crunch of financial resources, there can be a financial crunch, that we do not have the adequate financial resources, that you can just give it a gender outlook, saying that they might not be ready to, say, provide adequate finance when it comes to this particular gender. Yes, your various socio-cultural factors can be uh, reason, but again you have to see that we have to talk specifically about gender sensitive policies, right? So your religion plays a role when it comes to gender. We have already seen that your religion, particularly your established religions, most of them are inherently uh, based on inequality and discrimination, particularly against the other genders, particularly against female and the third gender. So we can definitely mention that. So I hope you got the understanding of this. Now, in this context, as a way forward, we were saying that you have to write a way forward. When you talk about gender sensitive policy, you can talk about gender based policy analysis. That what is the impact on this particular gender? Because it does not mean that you need a specific policy for women, specific policy for men. No. What this talks about is that when analyzing or evaluating a particular policy, just look at its impact on all the genders, whether it had an equal impact or the impact was differential. That's basically gender based policy analysis. So the way we were talking about gender budgeting, where we were not saying that you give separate fund for women. No, all you do is you see that proportional to the money that you have invested, what was the outcome. Similarly, here you are talking about the impact on. So you highlight the gender differences and inequalities, and you also find out whether the impact of these policy on a particular gender was right or not. Okay, so it is about gender based policy analysis. Now I have included this so that you can use this as a way forward in any question related to gender based policy analysis, or related to gender sensitive policies. Now, our next part of discussion is mechanisms for vulnerable sections. But what we'll do is, before we start with mechanisms for vulnerable sections, let's take a small break and meet at 3:20 p.m. What we'll do is, within this session, and we'll extend this session maybe for another half an hour or 1 hour after we are done with this, and we'll conclude our discussion on social issues and justice in this session itself. And you need not take up the last session. We need not start the last session, and let's wind it up within this session itself. And if you have any questions so far, you can write those questions. I know that policy analysis part is a little tricky, that you have this process. Some of you might get fixated with remembering at what is what stage. But ultimately, if you read it once or twice, there is a logical flow when it comes to policy selection process. Okay, so let's meet at 3:20 p.m. after the break and continue our discussion on two of the vulnerable sections. No, rather than taking up lecture 3, we will extend this particular lecture that is going on right now, and we'll conclude our discussion in this session itself. Welcome back, everyone. So I hope you have understood the policy process, various stages of the policy making process. You've understood various challenges at every stage and the solutions thereafter. Now let's start. Now, before we start with mechanisms for vulnerable section, in which we are going to cover two sections, one is transgenders and the other one is tribals. Let's take up whatever questions we have. So these are basically questions which have been given in your weekly tests that happened in the past 2 weeks. Let's look at the first question based on poverty. So the question says poverty in India is not merely an economic phenomena, but also a social phenomena, social one. Discuss. Now, when you think about poverty, you already know that poverty is not just social, economic, but also a political phenomena. It is also a psychological phenomena. It is also an environmental phenomena. That is something we know. But the question talks about these two dimensions specifically, that how poverty is both an economic and social phenomena. This is what they have asked. So what do? In the introduction, you give a glimpse of the dimensions of poverty. You talk about how it relates to well-being, and there are multiple dimensions of well-being. If you remember, there was that chart in our slides. Then you move on to and dedicate one small paragraph to the how poverty is an economic phenomena. Dedicate a small paragraph. So if we talk about social and economic, going by the language of the question, you can give social maybe 60 and economic dimension 40% of the weightage. So a paragraph on economic phenomena, then you move directly onto how poverty is a social phenomena as well. This is how you have to go about. Please tell me if you have any problem related to the body part. This can be your introduction, that poverty is a multidimensional phenomena. Then you talk specifically about how it is a social phenomena, how it is an economic phenomena. This is something that we have already covered as features of poverty. Then you go on to your conclusion part, wherein you can maybe bring about relationship between. This is just one way. I'm not saying this is the only way. There's one way of concluding this. You can bring about, or you can highlight the relationship between various dimensions of poverty. That poverty as an economic phenomena also has overlaps with poverty as a social phenomena. That means if you do not have sufficient family income, you would not be able to take care of your education, health, etc. You would not be able to have enough food and nutrients on your plate. That means poverty being a social and economic phenomena has overlaps. So you can maybe highlight that relationship. Similarly, you can maybe end it on a positive note, that how the government is taking up multidimensional approach in tackling poverty. Or you can contextualize saying that as we understand poverty as a multidimensional phenomena reflected in your multidimensional poverty index, this has gone a long way in alleviating poverty. And maybe you can quote the recent numbers from your national multidimensional poverty index, so that they understand, you know how to relate it to whatever is happening in current affairs. So I hope this question is clear. Yes, you can also talk about that how it is a vicious cycle of poverty and the way in which you can break it. There can be various ways to break it. But if it but the question is about the multi-dimensional poverty as a multi-dimensional phenomena. So let's try to end it on a dimensional note, for that matter, that how uh, we are taking a multi-dimensional approach using your multi-dimensional poverty index in alleviating poverty, and it is yielding the best results so far. Because you see that it has been one of the steepest decline in poverty numbers in the recent years. Next question: collaboration between public and private sectors That means public and private sector coming together. You can call it as PPP model. And yesterday someone has asked this question. Along with a suitable regulatory framework, can help create a balanced healthcare ecosystem that addresses the diverse needs of the Indian population. Critically analyze. You please read this question once. Collaboration between the public and private sectors, along with a suitable regulatory framework, can help create a balanced healthcare ecosystem. So, what is this balanced healthcare ecosystem? That addresses the diverse needs of the Indian population. What are these diverse needs of the Indian population? You already know. So, you can just give it 10% weightage, that what are the diverse needs of Indian population. Maybe you can start your introduction from here. And you can start your introduction with diverse needs of Indian population and what is the idea of a balanced healthcare ecosystem. That's where you can start. Can someone suggest what is this balanced healthcare ecosystem? Yes, Neha, great. So you can think of universal health coverage. All those components put together, access, affordability, and quality, will create a balanced healthcare ecosystem. That you get decent quality for comparatively lower prices at all places. So basically, your objective of the national health policy. So you know in the introduction what you can write. Now they're talking about how this collaboration between public and private sectors can lead to achieving this balance. So in your body part, what you have to do is how this public and private partnership or your PPP can help you achieve this. So one is its positives, but the other part is going to be its negative, because we have to critically analyze. So other part is going to be negative. So give equal weightage to both the positives and negatives of privatization or PPP, right? And then in your conclusion part, there are various ways to conclude this. So you can counterbalance the negatives, coming up with a way forward. Also, you have to remember that they are talking about suitable regulatory framework. So when there is a suitable regulatory framework, the negatives are not going to be many. It will keep a check on negative. So we were saying your private sector would not ensure quality. Regulatory framework can keep a check on that. Similarly, your private sector would not let it be affordable, will make it expensive. Your suitable regulatory framework can take care of that. So you have to remember that your negatives are not going to have that much weightage, because the question itself has highlighted the same. The question itself, the statement itself is saying that we are having a suitable regulatory framework. So the problems related to privatization are going to get diluted. So we have to reflect more on the positives of this PPP model. In the conclusion, you can still have a way forward. You can still talk about what are the other ways, because there can be other ways apart from this collaboration between public and private. There can be other ways to address these diverse needs of Indian population. What can be those other ways? There can be digitization. There can be your traditional medicine system. All those are also going to cater to the diverse needs of the Indian population. And you have already gone through what are these diverse needs. So I hope this question is clear. This is also a fairly simple question, but the idea is to address all the parts of the question. And you should understand, and you should understand that how much weightage has to be given to what. Because the question primarily talks about the collaboration of public and private sector and how it can help us create balanced healthcare ecosystem. So you have to understand that what is that balanced healthcare ecosystem, but they have also extended it saying diverse needs of Indian population. So you start with diverse needs itself, that these are the diverse needs of Indian population, and this is a balanced, this is the idea of a balanced healthcare ecosystem, and this is how with this PPP model we are going to go about it. But yes, there are going to be a few challenges, but those challenges will be under check because of your suitable regulatory framework. So what you can do is you can write the positives, write the negatives, and below the negatives you can say that given there is a suitable regulatory framework, all these things can be kept under check. Then conclude with a way forward. Either you provide a way forward for these negatives, but that way forward has already been given, suitable regulatory framework. The phrase itself is more than sufficient. Then alternatively, you can talk about various other ways or various other alternatives to achieve this balanced healthcare ecosystem. And I hope this question is clear. Moving on to the next question. Okay, this question has been discussed. So the question says, caste and class as two different forms of social stratification have often been found to overlap with each other. Examine. Caste and class, we already know that caste is a different form of social stratification. It stratifies the society on the basis of purity and pollution, on the idea of purity and pollution. Class is another way of social stratification on the basis of your wealth and prestige in society. They have often been found to overlap with each other. So if you want to dissect this question, one idea is that in the introduction, you briefly tell about how caste and class are different forms of social stratification. That how caste stratifies society and how class stratifies society. This can be your introduction, wherein you would have made these three things clear. Then you move on to the body part. Now, if you think about your body part, you find they are talking about caste and class. So the idea they are talking about is overlap. But we already know that apart from overlap, they have similarities. And apart from similarities, they have differences as well. But we have to give most of the weightage to overlap. And what was this overlap? Wherein we were saying that so and so few castes have fall in this class. So the so-called lower castes are generally found to be in the lower class. Similarly, the so-called upper class castes are found to be in the upper class. That is what this basically talks about, the overlap. Then second in your priority order is going to be similarities, that they because this overlap can be understood as both overlap and similarities as well. So we can talk about what kind of similarities do you find between caste and class system. And then you can briefly in your conclusion part, very briefly in your conclusion part, talk about the differences, because it is a 10 marker, so you do not have a lot of scope for writing big introduction and conclusion. So your introduction is going to be say 2 lines. Similarly, your conclusion is also going to be 2 lines. In these 2 lines, you briefly tell about what are the differences between caste and class. And if you want to highlight the differences or similarities, how do you do it? You look at the features of these social institutions. I hope you have not forgotten, because I know it has been 2 weeks. Some of you might have forgotten, but the moment you go through your slides for revision, you'll remember instantly, because that's how we have basically discussed all the social institutions. That if you want to look at the change, look at the features. You want to look at the change, look at the functions. Then look into what kind of significance it has, what kind of consequences it brings. So I hope this question is clear. And I think we had discussed a similar question in the class as well. Okay, yes. So here I've integrated poverty, health, and education. So it says poverty is the single biggest challenge in the face of health and education in India. Yes, Abhinav, PPTs would be more than enough for that matter for your revision. But still, I would suggest you make your brief synoptic notes, because the way in which your PPTs have been created, the older PPTs have been created, is the synoptic way. So it will be a quick revision. It will take a little more time in writing compared to maybe just going through these slides. It'll take a little more time, but it will give you a lot of flexibility for future. Because in future, what you can do is you can take up if once you create these notes, you can keep integrating your current affairs there, and you can write things in your own language. You can add new questions, you can add new perspectives, examples, etc. So it will give you more flexibility for that matter in the future. Okay, poverty is the single biggest challenge in the face of health and education. Critically analyze. So when we have to critically analyze, we have to give both sides of the argument. So the one idea says, yes, poverty is the single biggest challenge, and the other idea says, no, poverty is not the single biggest challenge. So when you consider no, then you have to think about what are the other challenges to health and education. What are the other challenges to health and education? We know that poverty is one of the most important challenge, but what are the other challenges to health and education? I would suggest you go through the class. I suggest you go through the class. If you have missed the class, you can just watch it in speed. You can just put 1.5 times speed and you can go through it. Yes, your vulnerable section is the last chapter. So basically, as already discussed, as already highlighted, the syllabus doesn't talk about your vulnerable sections. The syllabus talks about various schemes and policies and the issues arising out of design and implementation of these schemes and policies for vulnerable section. And that's what I was saying. uh, because we do not read these statements and the syllabus carefully, that's why most of the students end up reading vulnerable sections as a separate topic, but it is not vulnerable sections. But also I have told you that I'll still take up two vulnerable sections in which students are mostly confused, so that there is clarity. And we have already covered a couple of vulnerable sections like children, like women and elderly previously. Okay, so you already know what can be the other challenges to health and education. So you give 50% weightage to this, and you give 50% weightage to how poverty is the single biggest challenge in the face of health and education. I don't think we have to. I don't think we have to say discuss this, because this has been discussed yesterday. We have discussed health and education yesterday, and we already know what are the various challenges in the face of health and education. And we have also discussed poverty, how poverty is going to impact these. So you just have to expand on this. No, yes, we do not have today, or this class rather, this class is going to be your last class for social issues and justice. We do not have a class on next Saturday. I was planning to take up an extra session because I was not well, so we were going a little slow for the past couple of days. Even in the last week we were going a little slow because of my sickness. But yes, we have been able to cover in time, finish in time. So we will not need the next class on next Saturday. Okay. So in this part, this is your body part, right? And in your conclusion, you already know, if you're writing a lot of negative, you give us a way forward, or you tell us about various government intervention to fix the same problem. You talk about various government interventions like Poshan, that people are not able to get sufficient nutrition because of poverty, thereby Poshan Abhiyan, for instance. So you give a couple of examples of government intervention, or you suggest a way forward that how we are supposed to go about it. The body part is also clear. Now let's come to your introduction part. In your introduction, one way to go about it is that you just briefly talk about how poverty can be a challenge to society in general. How poverty can be a challenge to society in general, because poverty impacts all the dimensions of life. So you can basically talk about how poverty is a multi-dimensional phenomena, and it has consequences in each and every dimension of life. Second thing is that you can talk about, yes, I was coming to that idea, that you can also briefly highlight what are the various challenges to our healthcare and education sector in India. That can also be your introduction. But ultimately, in the body part, when you argue against the statement, you will be talking about those challenges. So it is better you talk about how poverty is a multidimensional phenomena and basically impacts all the aspects of your life, not just your health and education. It was about this question, and this is again a fairly simple question. Moving on to the next question. The next question talks about the legitimacy and accountability of self-help groups. Legitimacy and accountability of self-help groups and their patrons, the microfinance outfits, need systematic assessment and scrutiny for sustained success of the concept. So basically, the question is talking about highlighting the problems related to legitimacy and accountability of self-help groups, and also talk about how this systematic assessment can actually make self-help groups a success, right? Because we find that most of your self-help groups do not actually achieve the objective that they are supposed to. Yes, okay. So Avni is suggesting for the previous question that you can talk about the status of health and education in India. Great. This is a good suggestion. You can start with this. Right. That's why you have to contribute more and more so that everyone learns. It is not just your, say, learning on a personal level, but it actually helps other learn as well. Okay. So what you have to do is you have to address that what are basically these legitimacy and accountability related issues, that these are informal groups, then they do not have any accountability mechanism. That is what the problem is. And then you talk about why is there a need for systematic assessment and scrutiny, because there can be malpractices, because there can be various challenges related to these self-help groups, and that's why you need this systematic assessment. And that's how, on this note, you can conclude this answer. It is again 200 words, so you do not need a long introduction and conclusion. So basically, in the introduction, you can highlight other issues apart from accountability and legitimacy. So if you remember self-help groups that we have just discussed in the previous session, we were saying that there can be governance related issues with these civil societies or with these self-help groups. There can be socio-economic hurdles, and I'd given you a list of various type of challenges and hurdles that these self-help groups face. So they are talking specifically about the governance ones. So those things can be discussed here in the body part. But in the introduction, you can talk about various other hurdles that self-help groups face, that they are not able to sustain because of gender bias. They are not able to sustain because of other socio-cultural hurdles. They are not able to succeed because of various economic constraints. So there are various dimensions. So you can just highlight them briefly, then come to the body part and cover these two aspects. So I hope this question is also clear. Now, this is the last question that I have included. Also, you just go through the answer, you will be able to understand. So what it talks about is how can we make centrally sponsored schemes effective? So the first thing is that you highlight what are these centrally sponsored schemes that are funded directly by your central ministries and department, but are implemented by states and their agencies. Now, what can be the problems? So you had highlighted something, that every state has different challenges and those challenges need different solutions. So that is the first thing. Apart from that, there can be various other aspects, that there is no coordination between the center and the state. The center is not giving funds in time. Then the center, say, is is coercing the states to follow so and so method, which can also be a problem, and other aspects. So you can just go through this answer. I have given the complete answer for this question, and then would be more than sufficient to understand. And that would be all about your implementation of design and policy. Apart from this, we have already discussed your gender sensitive policy, and look at 23 questions. Look at 2023 question, and there was a question related to gender sensitive policy. I do not remember the exact question, but there was a question related to gender sensitive policy. So Sneha is talking about provide a charter with suitable language, create advertisement. Yes, those can be the things, but we have to talk specifically about centrally sponsored schemes. So centrally sponsored scheme, we have to talk about those shortcomings first, and then we can talk about other issues related to implementation. And rather than issues, it talks about suggestions, right? So those issues will create their own suggestions. That is not going to be a problem. Then you come to the later part, that there can be issues related to implementation as well, that there is no independent body to evaluate. The evaluation that is being carried out is not proper, etc. Now let's take up your first vulnerable group, That is your scheduled tribes. Now, when you talk about scheduled tribes, you already know what are scheduled tribes according to the constitution. You know all the constitutional dimension, but that is not our concern here. Our concern is who are these tribals, because these tribal Indians are getting this tag of scheduled tribes, right? So, who are these tribals? How are they different? What are the challenges that they face, and what can be the solution to the same? So, we are not going to take up legal provisions here, but we are going to talk about the basic framework of their social life. Can anyone suggest who are tribals? And if we want to approach this question, who are tribals, how do we go about it? Anyone? Jen says forest dwellers. Okay. Anyone else? Aditya says the same. Sneha also says the same. Sian says socio-economically backward classes. Okay. Avni says, again, they live in remote areas and they have a different way of life. Okay. Now, first thing that we have to understand is, let's first challenge whatever we have already discussed. Whatever we have mentioned, let's challenge this. And it does not mean that your answer is wrong. All your answers are correct. There is no doubt about it. But let's challenge everything. So we are saying that these tribals are forest dwellers. What about the tribals who live in hilly areas? What about the tribals who live in the state of Rajasthan? What about the tribals who move from one place to another? That means first thing is clear. If we talk about their place of residence, it is varied. So you find that in your central India, eastern part, they are living in forested areas, remote forested areas. Then there are other tribal groups who move from one place to another, because someone had, Ragini has given an example of Banjaras. When tribal groups, they move from one place to another. Then there can be tribal groups who are basically peasants. There can be tribal groups who rely on hunting and gathering. There can be tribal groups who are IAS officers, right? So one idea is that when it comes to the residents, generally they come either from forests, hilly areas, or they move from one place to another. That means they follow a nomadic lifestyle generally. But again, you find that when you think about tribals, let's start. Yes, I'll come to your point, Balaraju, but it is a little different from what others told. Your point is also correct. We'll come to that. Another thing is, when you look at tribals, you also look at tribals in the light of change, right? Because their lifestyle, everything, every aspect of life has changed. Why? Because of interaction with other people, because of interaction with their neighborhood peasants, because of their interaction with government officials, because of their interaction and relationship with the Britishers. So they are also undergoing change. So yes, you can say that the ones who used to live in forests, because now you find that the ones who are living in forests have also become a part of the mainstream lifestyle. So they had a different way of life. Now, when you talk about way of life, in your way of life, there'll be religion. In your way of life, there'll be language. In your way of life, there'll be other aspects, that how they lead their life, their value system, everything is going to be different. Now, the simple idea is, when you talk about tribal religion, most of the tribals previously used to follow their own animistic religions, different religions for every tribal group. Someone believes in a flower, they go on praying to a flower. Someone believes in a rock, they go on praying to a rock. Someone to the sky, someone to something that is unknown, maybe the atmosphere, etc. So everyone had a different idea or conception of religion. And now these tribal groups also have a lot of diversity amongst themselves. So we are saying There are tribal groups who are living in forests, then there are tribal groups who are living in hilly areas. Similarly, when it comes to their way of life, you also talk about various social institutions. So the institution of family. Yes, you'll find that today, with because of the interaction with outside world and also otherwise, you find most of the tribal families will be patriarchal in nature. But yes, again, these are the ones, few tribal groups which have a matriarchal structure of family. Then the way they organize their social life is also different. There are the ones which live in clans. There are ones who do not form any, say, form of clan. They just live together. That's it. There are ones who share their land holding. There is a particular tribe which will have a common piece of land, and everyone cultivates the same piece of land and they share the produce. Then there are tribes in which all the male members will go out hunting, all the female members will go out gathering fruits, etc., vegetables from the forest. They'll bring everything together and they'll share it amongst themselves. There are leaderless tribes as well. So, when it comes to tribes, one thing is important, that is that they have a lot of diversity. Then, when we were talking about endogamy, exogamy, when we were talking about other rules of spouse selection, all the exceptions were generally coming from tribes, be it material local families. Then we were also talking about the idea of polygamy, and I had given you example of a tribe from Himachal Pradesh which still practices polygamy, right? We're talking about one wife and multiple husbands, for that matter, polyandry. So you'll find that amongst themselves as well, tribals are not a homogeneous group. They have a lot of diversity. That means they are a heterogeneous group. That this tribal group amongst themselves, they have a lot of differences. So they have diversity in terms of race, they have diversity in terms of the language that they use, they have diversity in terms of the religion that they follow, they have diversity in terms of their way of life. Now also, when coming back to religion, so we were saying that most of the tribes used to follow their own particular religion, but with the advent of Britishers, you find that Christianity was introduced, and you find particularly your northeastern tribes embraced Christianity. Now, with Britishers, another thing happened, that you had fast developing modes of transportation, that roads were laid down even to the interior areas, because of which now other people could have also traveled, and other people also started traveling to those areas, to those uh, previously remote areas. And now in their interaction, you find most of your central tribes and northern tribes, they converted to Hinduism, for that matter. So they have adopted an established religion, giving away their own particular religion that they used to follow. Then when it comes to language, there's a lot of diversity. You already know that there are still tribes whose language we're not able to figure out, that what is the kind of language, because they still do not keep in touch with the outside world. They live in their own small space. They live there, they marry each other, and that's how they live. They do not have any contact whatsoever with the outside world. So they are untouched by development. So there are few tribes which are untouched by development. Then there are other tribes which are way more advanced. So think of your tribal community from Rajasthan, that is Meenas. And you find that a lot of Meenas are there in administration, in government services. That means they have developed. They are bearing, or they are actually enjoying the fruits of development. Then there are tribes like Jarawas who are untouched by any form of development. And also the ones which came under the influence of which got to interact with people from other linguistic communities, they adopted their language. So we find that a lot of these tribal groups will speak varied dialects of the same regional language. So if they are speaking Oriya, if the regional language is Oriya, they also have a dialect similar to Oriya. Why? Because it has, under the influence of the majority community, their language, and all the other traditions have also changed. And that's where you find, because there is a lot of hue and cry about globalization, there is a lot of hue and cry about we adopting, say, international languages, people speaking English, etc. But don't you think, because of the majoritarian culture of a country, because of the impact of majoritarian culture on the minority culture, we have basically diminished their own culture? I don't think that the impact of, say, language English would be more than the impact of various regional languages that is there on tribals. I don't think there would have been more religious conversions than what happened to the tribals. So, yes, this is about society, and that's why we say that we need plural culture. We need to understand the issues, various aspects of tribals as well. Otherwise, their culture will get diminished, will be lost, and we would not be able to retain it. Okay, so when it comes to their various aspects of life, when it comes to their levels of development, when it comes to their diversity in terms of race, language, etc., you find there is a lot of diversity amongst this group of tribals. So this group of tribals is not a homogeneous group. And again, on the basis of which area, so there are people, or there are tribals who are coming from forested areas, they'll have different challenges. There are tribals who move from one place to another. There are tribals who take up shifting cultivation or zoom cultivation. They'll face different challenges. There are tribals who still believe in hunting and gathering. There are tribals who are employed in industries. There are tribals who have become administrators, civil servants. So every tribal group is going to have a different set of challenges. So we always have to remember not to consider this tribal group as a homogeneous group, because everyone will always have different set of challenges. Even when it comes to their value system, every tribal group will have their own value system, and it is close to impossible. Yes, your anthropologists do that. We do not have to go into the finer details of those things. Now this is just to basically talk about the diversity that is there when it comes to tribals. Okay, Balaraju, sorry, I forgot to address your question. The ones who did not bring modernity in lifestyle is called tribals. Okay, so I have already highlighted. So when we talk about changes or social changes, and particularly modernity, we find that there are a few tribal groups who have embraced modernity. Then there are other tribal groups who are untouched by any form of development or modern lifestyle. Then there are other tribals who follow a mix of both, right? So there are various ways. Jen, due to no, yes, so yes, it is basically impact of modernization, and it generally started with the advent of Britishers. Because before the Britishers came in India, you did not have advanced means of transport and communication, right? So they were living in relative isolation. But then there were other groups who were nomadic, who were moving from one place to another. They were already under the influence of the majoritarian culture. Okay, so you find that when it comes to the spread of your tribal groups, there are few states, central and eastern states, which have most of your tribal population, like Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh. Then the northeastern region, your northeastern states have close to 12% of your tribals. They also represent diverse ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups, as already discussed. There's no uniformity in their levels of development, again discussed. Then they've given an example of Mizoram, that close to 100% literacy in Mizoram. Whereas if you talk about Zarawas and Shompe's in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, they're still living in the state of nature. They do not have any contact with the outside world. Now, also, the tribal population within the states also is different. Now, on this note, this is just a, say, prelims and prelims kind of fact. Do you know any state where there is no population of tribals? No population of tribals. Do you know any state? where you don't have any population of tribals? Anyone? Delhi is not a state. No, UP has considerable tribal population. Okay, it's okay. You search about this because this data comes from census. Once you Google it, you'll find it. Yes, Punjab, and then Haryana as well, and then union territories of Delhi and Chandigarh. Okay, you just look into this. I've just told you a fact. You can just Google it. Okay, now let's look at issues. So we have already understood that these tribals are not a homogeneous group. So they are coming from different groups. So they are going to face different challenges. So these challenges again can be discussed in dimensions: economic, political, social, etc. Let's take up one by one. Shrikant, okay. Yeah, not Rajasthan. I've just given an example, and there are a lot of tribes in Rajasthan for that matter. Okay, so Aditya is asking, I think we have covered this point. So you're asking that generally it is said that the northeastern states have more tribes. It is about the proportion that Nagaland has more than 98% of tribal population. But that is within the state. We are talking about overall population of tribals within a state, within those states. There is a difference. There is a difference. So if there are 100 people, one idea is there are 98 tribals. But if you look at these 98 tribals, they are nothing when we say the total population of tribals is 1 lakh, right? Okay, so let's start with issues. So we say, just understand the basic idea that tribals, generally living in the state of nature, generally relying on hunting and gathering, slowly started picking up agriculture over the years under the influence of their neighbors who were peasants, farmers, etc. Were generally these coming from Hindu groups. So slowly and steadily, they also learned to take up agriculture. And now you find that when it comes to agriculture, the share of land that you have matters a lot. So if you have a small land holding, you would not be able to carry out agriculture. Now your tribals, they have a different culture. So they basically believed in, uh, you can call it a primitive communism form of system, right? So you can call it primitive form of communism. So what they do is they have a common piece of land. No one owns that land. That land belongs to the community. That land belongs to the entire tribe. That land doesn't belong to any individual. They cultivate the land together, they take produce out of it, and they share it in an equitable manner. Now, with time, you find that the total number of the land holding that they had started shrinking. Why? Because previously it was all forested, and now other communities, farming community particularly, started clearing land for agriculture. So the land holding that they had couldn't expand. Why? Because their population is increasing, but they are not able to expand their territory. Now, because of these small land holdings, they started facing problems of land scarcity, and then they started moving outwards as well. Similarly, they started practicing shifting cultivation. So they'll use one piece of land, cultivate, then move to another, then move to another, so on and so forth. So you already know those practices from geography, right? Then with British rule, what happened was that this process got fast tracked. Why? Because the Britishers started laying down road and railway infrastructure across the country. They improved the means of transportation and communication, which became a problem for them. Why? Because now people could easily travel to those areas. Otherwise, they were living in remote areas, and who would dare go in a dense forest? Who would dare go on the top of a, say, Himalayan hill? So they were living in relative isolation and peace, but because of these improved means of communication and transportation, new intruders from outside, because that's what they feel, the tribals feel, that people from outside started coming, occupying their land, etc. Now also, with the developmental agenda of the Britishers and later the Indian government, they started losing whatever existing land holdings they had. Why? Because they had to create, say, dams, they had to create canals, they had to lay down infrastructure for industry, they had to expand the railway network. For that you need land, for that you need to occupy land. And it was primarily your tribals who were getting displaced in these various projects. Now they are getting displaced from their land, they do not have sufficient land holding, and that's when they a lot of tribals, whoever got the opportunity, started working in industries as say unskilled labor, for that matter. Now they do not have any kind of expertise, they do not have the business sense. Why? Because they still believe in subsistence agriculture. Now the agriculture that they were carrying out, they were not selling the produce, they're not selling the surplus. They'll they'll cultivate as much as they need. So they lived on subsistence agriculture. But with their increasing population and with a lot of say cash crops coming into picture, you find that they also started selling surplus. So once they started selling surplus, they'll take the money and they'll buy whatever things they need from the market. So this is how slowly their lifestyle is changing. Now with their this changing lifestyle, you find a lot of people from outside started living there in these areas, in search of newer opportunities, in search of say agricultural land, etc. Now these tribals, who are relatively say innocent, who are relatively say less smart, they were being exploited because of this innocence that they had, that their land was being taken away by your money lenders, their land was being taken away by your middlemen, by hook or by crook. So some of the land was taken away by the government for developmental agenda, and then some of the land was being taken away as a form of exploitation by your farming peasant community and your trading community. Now what happens is that if you do not have this, then you start looking for other options, then you start looking for work in industries, then you start looking for work in other areas, so you start migrating as well. And that's where, so it is because your life is centered around economic activities. It is ultimately the economic activities that you take up decide what direction you are going in your life, whether you'll be able to lead a happy or a life which gives you enough to eat and a decent lifestyle, or whether you are going in the right opposite direction. Then also, over time, land degradation started happening. Why? Because of overuse of land. So I hope these ideas are clear. So these started becoming issues, and uh, the basic idea is whenever any human species starts feeling or starts facing any issues, they simply look for an alternative, because you have to do something about it. And that's how their lifestyle, entire lifestyle, started changing. Now when it comes to agriculture, then I was saying that from hunting and gathering community and from subsistence agriculture, they started moving a little towards modern agriculture, slowly and steadily. So if they were not using any plows before, looking at the farming community, they started using plows. So but still, to modernize agriculture, they do not have any kind of credit facilities, they did not even have papers for their land, and that's how the land got stolen during the land reforms, because it was a land without anyone who's claiming it on paper. So a lot of people usurped that land from them. Now they, even to carry out any kind of agriculture, they do not have the money to buy any modern equipment or to buy good seeds, etc. They do not have any proper irrigation facility. Their fields will have low productivity. Why? Because they are not using good fertilizers, etc. They do not have, yes, they do have traditional knowledge of organic say agriculture, but they do not know the modern techniques. But if you want to survive in today's market, you get to know, you have to know your modern techniques. Then uh, they were getting displaced from there, so their land holdings were also getting smaller. Then the land was also getting degraded. Then you do not have ample opportunities for irrigation available. They are using very primitive crude techniques. All these led to this problem with respect to productivity of their agriculture. Then the ones who were living in forests, with Britishers, they started imposing restrictions, primarily for the reason that they wanted timber from the forest. They wanted timber from the forest, so they started imposing restrictions. So they started making boundaries. Now, also, not just your Britishers, even your Indian government did the same. And then also, you have a lot many people coming from outside living and competing against the tribals, because they also want to make a living. The tribals also want to make a living. So there is a lot of competition from the outsiders. Now, because the tribals are living on subsistence, so their basic survival instinct kicks in. Their basic survival is also getting impacted. Now, then also you find that we still have disputes about the boundaries, demarcation of the forest areas, etc., whether they can go and get timber from the forest or not. What is the quantity of timber they can get? What is the quantity of produce they can get? And all these conflicts ultimately led to displacement of tribals and their poor situation. Then government also started confronting, because people initially were not even aware. Even today, if you ask someone, they are not aware what are their problems. And you'd be surprised to know that even particularly in urban areas, people are not even aware about the tribals. So they have a vague idea what tribals are. They also think that maybe it is they fall somewhere in the so-called lower caste bracket of the Hindu system, without understanding that they have a different culture. They had nothing to do with Hinduism, and it is much later that they adopted Hinduism or Christianity, and they were living a different kind of life. Now, when it comes to education, we already know that the socioeconomic indicators in tribal groups are very low. When it comes to education, one idea is that they do not have ample opportunities for getting educated. Second, they do not understand the significance of education. Third, they do not have the money to get educated. Then also, yesterday we were discussing, when we were talking about the language thing, we were saying that people or students should be taught in their mother tongue till a certain standard, till a standard preferably. Now, if you look at tribals, you find that most of the tribals are not educated, so you rarely find teachers coming from the same tribal group. Now, these bunch of tribal students who are sitting in a classroom are being taught by a teacher who doesn't even understand their culture, who doesn't even understand their language. So, obviously, the learning outcomes are also going to be poor. And that's where it is being decided that let's have a separate, say, push towards local culture of those regions, the role of SCRT that we were talking about. And also, particularly for tribals, they talk about having a different curriculum compared to the mainstream curriculum. Now, also, we see that tribals are facing issues. We're seeing that tribals are facing issues because of their interaction with the mainstream society and their interaction with the government. Because otherwise, they were living happily and they were living in relative peace. Yes, they were fighting amongst each other. They were still apprehensive of the outsiders, etc. But yes, at least they had sufficient. They were living a decent lifestyle. So in this regard, you have this Panchsheel policy suggested by Jawaharlal Nehru, which can be used as a way forward. So whenever they talk about how to deal with this situation, do we leave them or do we let them live uh, outside the mainstream society in alienation, in marginalization, or do we completely integrate them in mainstream society? But the answer is the middle path. So we have to talk about how they should be made to develop according to their own genius, according to their own ideas, according to their own expertise. their rights on lands and forests should be respected, that they, the ones who are still following that hunting gathering lifestyle, they should they should be allowed to lead the lifestyle that they want. Their rights should be recognized and respected. Then also, there should be a team of their own people. That means there should be a team of tribal people who should be working there in administration and development, who should be working in the field of education, etc. So they feel connected, so that they do not reject the idea altogether. Because what they feel is that people from different culture, people from different regions are coming and ruling over us, dictating their terms. That's what they feel. So let them have their own people, let them have people coming from the same community, who are going to help them, who are going to nourish them, who are going to help them with the developmental process. Then also, without understanding their idea of development, without having a stakeholder approach, let's not overwhelm them with a multiplicity of schemes. Why? Because they are not say giving the desired result. Then also, rather than looking at statistics, we should look at whether the quality of their character, the quality of their personality has improved or not. Now again, this is a very theoretical framework. So put it in, if you think of it, uh, that how it can be implemented, it is going to be a different thing, it is going to be a different way. This is very ideal, but again, it gives you the idea about middle path. This talks about uh, that the tribal culture, the tribal identities should not be subjugated when it comes to your, or should not be subjugated with interaction with the majority community. That's what the idea is. So when we are talking about levels of interaction in globalization and various forms of social change, various forces of social change, we are talking about striking the right balance. We're talking about the Gandhian idea, and this is how this idea, this policy of Panchsheel has been derived. Okay, so Sneha is saying that if we focus upon tribals too, I think we can counter the poverty and other stages in a better way. So yes, but again, we have to see that what is their idea of development, right? So it has to happen according to their own demands, according to what they feel is right. That's what needs to happen. Now, what you have to do is, because no matter how much you read on tribals is not going to be sufficient. So one idea is that your scheduled tribes part from your polity lectures should be included here, even though they would not ask a question here. Even if they ask a question in paper 2, the question is going to be from polity rather than justice. But also, your polity lectures will give you enough content. Your polity lectures will give you enough content for writing any kind of policy scheme framework for tribals as well. And also, when it comes to society, you have to think about the diversity in tribals when it comes to various social institutions, when it comes to the way they organize their social and religious life, right? So I've just given you a glimpse of it, that how it goes, because it is basically anthropological study which takes up this aspect. And there as well, it is more depth than width. So they basically take up one tribal group and they start digging deeper and deeper. Then when things would have started to change, what is their culture, etc., etc. So which also does not give you a clear picture. What I would suggest is, in your ARM, in your additional reading material, we have given a little content on tribals that should be more than sufficient. But again, you do not know what kind of questions they ask. So as already discussed in the first lecture, that your NCRT, your current affairs, and your classroom notes are going to be sufficient, provided you are taking it up sincerely, you are understanding things sincerely. So next vulnerable section is your transgenders. Now let's look at the definition. We will take this up one by one. Do not worry, initially you might feel, for a bit you might feel that I'm not able to understand, but just stay with me. By the time we finish the next slide, you'll be able to understand. Transgenders are people individuals of any age or sex, whose physical appearance, whose personal characteristics and behavior differ from the stereotypes about how men and women are supposed to be. So basically, if you talk about uh, various stereotypes, gender stereotypes, how a person is supposed to walk. So you expect a girl to walk differently compared to a boy. That is what a gender stereotype. So just think about a situation wherein there is a boy who walks like what we supposed, what we think is supposed to be a girl's walk. What is that? A difference in their personal characteristic. Then, in terms of appearance as well, and various physical traits, you find there can be differences. So, the basic idea is when we were talking about the concept of gender, we were saying it is a sociological construct, that how a person is supposed to behave. On the basis of their sex, we determine whether a person is supposed to be rude or polite. On the basis of their sex, we suppose that a person, or we believe that a person is supposed to walk this way or that way. So those are what gender stereotypes. But when it comes to transgenders, they do not fall within this category of the gender stereotypes that we are talking about. They behave differently. So they can be from one sex and still behave like another sex. That means the way they identify their gender is different from their sex. Generally, we say that the biological sex and gender has to go hand in hand. But in this case, their sex is not determining how they identify their gender to be. That's what the idea behind transgenders is. Now, when we talk of transgenders, the first idea that comes to your mind is eunuchs, or your hijras, as we call it in South Asia, who are basically uh, your intersex, who have who do not have the say sexual anatomy of one of the sexes. So if you look at their say genetical makeup, and if you look at their, what do you say, their biological features, you find that it is a mix of both. And they can also have both the genitals of male and female. They might have the male organs, and they might be dysfunctional, they might not function. Those are what inex hijras, or intersex as we call them. Now, but when we talk about transgenders, it is anyone, it is not just limited to hijras, but it is anyone whose gender identity does not fall in uh, this gender stereotype that we talk about. So their gender identity differs from their assigned sex at birth. So a person who is born male might behave like what we call your uh, female gender. Similarly, there can be a girl who behaves in a way which we generally call, or generally associate with, males. So their gender identity is different. It is not related to their say biological or sexual identity. That is what transgenders are. So you have already understood what are intersex. Intersex, generally you call hijras. They have uh, say sexual anatomy. It can be about genitals, it can be about your say genetical makeup, which does not fit with the traditional markers of male and female. Now these are your transgenders. Now apart from this, you'll find that anyone for that matter, whose gender identity is different, can be called as transgender. So one idea is that of gender identity, the other idea is that of sexual orientation. Now coming to a sexual orientation part, there can be, generally it is considered that you are supposed to get attracted to the opposite sex. So if you are a boy, you are supposed to get attracted to a girl. And now, if you look at your gays and lesbians, so lesbians are basically women who get attracted to girls, who are not attracted to men. Similarly, gays are boys or a man who is primarily attracted to men, other men, rather than girls, which they are supposed to basically attract. So this is about their sexual orientation. Similarly, there can be individuals who are bisexual who get attracted to both the sexes. So a boy who gets attracted to both boys and girls, then a girl who gets attracted to both boys and girls. What is that? Again, sexual orientation. Then there can be others who do not get attracted to any sex, asexual. Now, it is not forced. When you talk about celibacy, it is forced. This is not forced. Naturally, biologically, they are not getting attracted to any sex. Then there are pansexuals. Pansexuals are people or individuals who get attracted to all the gender variations. Then again, about sexual orientation. But then you think about your transsexuals, which are left out. Now, the difference basically is when you talk about transgenders, we are saying that their gender identity is not the same as their sexual identity. But because their gender identity is not equivalent or not similar to their sexual identity, if they take up any kind of sexual therapy or say they undergo any kind of say organ change transplant, they'll be termed as transsexuals. Why? Because they try to align their gender identity to their sexual identity. Because generally what we do is we think of transgenders or say homosexuality as a disease, as a problem. That's what we feel. And because we think of it as a problem, we always think that if a person is not identifying to their biological sex, they should be treated in a way, or there should be a therapy, etc., so that they start behaving or they start getting attracted to to the opposite sex, right? So they talk about changing their gender identity, but there are people who change their sexual identity for the sake of their gender identity. Those are termed as transsexuals. So this is basically the array. No need to get confused. No one is going to ask who are gays, lesbians, etc. This is just for your basic understanding. So when you talk about this third gender, this is also on the basis of sexual orientation and on the basis of gender identity. So being gay does not mean that they are identifying themselves as a girl. No, being gay means that they are sexually oriented in a way that they get attracted to boys, right? So there is a difference. So you always have to remember. Now, if I ask you about various issues related to transgenders, now the first thing that should come to your mind is, are they going to have similar problems? Do you think a person who is lesbian, a girl who is a lesbian, and then a transgender or an intersex, are they going to face similar challenges? And the answer is no. Why? Because you are not aware about their sexual orientation. As long as they don't come out, you would never get to know. People do not get to know about others' sexual orientation, even their life partner's sexual orientation, till the end of their life. So they would not have similar set of problem. They will have different problems. Now the issues that we are going to take up are issues related to faced by transgenders, intersex and transsexuals. So please remember that, because they'll have different set of problems. So the problems that you face on the basis of your sexual orientation will be summarized with your discussion on homosexuality. And again, we are going to keep that discussion very brief. It is a part of your polity and constitution. One. Second, it was in news. Your same-sex marriage was in news, and it has been discussed, debated widely in your newspapers. So I think you already have been overwhelmed with the information. All we have done is, I think in chapter 1, I think that was the day when this decision came out, and we were talking about how same-sex marriage would change marriage and family as an institution, because it will change the features, of the institution, and it will also change the functions. Now, if it changes the functions and features, there can be consequences of that. There can be positive consequences, negative consequences. So I think we have discussed that part. But anyways, we are not going into the constitutional dimension, and we have discussed the social dimension of the same. Now let's talk about issues faced by transgenders. Now, when you have to think about issues faced by a particular group of people, what do? You take up various dimensions of their life. You take up the economic dimension of their life. You take up social dimension of their life. You take up their public and private life, education, health, etc. Now, the first question that I'll start with is, in your classroom, in a school, how many transgenders or intersex or hijras you had? Or in your college, or maybe the society that you live in, do you have anyone living around you, or do you have anyone interacting to you, or do you have anyone studying with you? Anyone? Yes. So as expected, everyone says no, none. So the first idea is that we do not know anything about what are the problems, what are the issues, what are their lifestyle, how is it different, is it the same, etc. about transgenders. Why? Because they do not have any form of identity. If people like us who are living in urban areas, if we do not know, if we do not have anyone sitting with us, just think about the situation in rural areas. And also, when it comes to this lack of identity is not just their social identity, but their family identity as well. Even their families do not accept them, even their families reject them. Now, because of this, if the family has rejected the child, where do you think they can go for education? Nowhere. Who will pay for the fee? Who is going to give them a place to live? Who is going to give them a roof over their head? They would not have any kind of property rights, etc. Now, because of their lack of social indicators, they would not find any kind of employment opportunities. And similarly, you would not find any transgenders working around you in your workplace. Then in their public life, there'll be a problem when it comes to which toilet to use. Right? There can be various problems related to that, both ways. Because tomorrow anyone can come up and say that I identify as a girl and I would want to use the girls' washroom or the women bathroom in public, which is going to be a problem, right? Because when it comes to self-identification of gender, there can be problems as well. So we are not saying that everything has to be made according to them, but we have to strike the right balance. Then they do not get any property rights, they get exploited by the police, they get ridiculed. And think about this, forget about transgenders who identify differently. Then there are people who simply have a little more, say, genetic incline towards the other gender, right? A few traits, etc. Think about how they are ridiculed in the classrooms, in schools and colleges, in workplaces, even though they do not, they just have a little, say, genetic hint of the other gender, and they get ridiculed. Think about your transgenders. So when it comes to healthcare, again, and when talking about gender inequality, I had told you that when it comes to gender inequality, we have to also consider our third gender, because the problem there is even more serious, is even more grave. I'll come to the health indicators in your transgenders, and you'll get to know that where the problem lies. Then they would not have homes. Obviously, they are going to live in poverty because they are not being employed, they are not educated, they do not have a place to live. So complete exclusion, complete marginalization from the mainstream society. Then because of these social pressures, social stigma, you find high levels of mental illness. And because of these high levels of mental illness, you find a prevalence of alcoholism or addiction of alcohol in your transgenders. Now, with no opportunities to work, with no opportunities to get educated, with no opportunities to get decent healthcare, they end up begging and dancing. So you'll find them asking for 5 rupees, 10 rupees on your signals. You'll find them going to, say, households or going to families where there was a recent wedding or a child was born, and they'll ask for money from there. And we say that yes, there can be an extortion racket that is going on, but otherwise you see that they do not have any kind of employment opportunities. They do not have any kind of skill that is being developed. So what else do they do? Because government, for that matter, your Bombay Bagri Act has had criminalized your begging and any public form of entertainment, right? Public display like your dancing, etc. It was banned. And now you see that, yes, we are not saying that this is right, that they should extort money, etc. But again, society as a whole needs to understand that this is a particular group which has its own set of problems which need to be addressed. Because ultimately, it is not good for that section, but also for the society at large. Yes, so the family disowns them, etc. And also, you find that ultimately they have a different culture because they live separately, they have a different lifestyle, which we are not aware of. Why? Because they keep it secret. And you find that, particularly in the case of intersexes, it is right at birth, right after birth, because one of the purpose of going for dancing and asking for money after a child is born is to check whether they are intersex or not. And if they are intersex, they instantly take away the child. That's what happens. And they lead a very secret life. And again, you'll find a lot of them struggling in prostitution. The levels of violence against them, and particularly sexual violence, is high, and they are generally marginalized from the society. These are basic issues. Now, these are general issues about various dimensions of life. Let's come to health. Now, if the family has disowned, the society is ridiculing them. Who's going to get them vaccinated? Who's going to provide them basic health care? No one. And similarly, there is high prevalence of HIV because of this sexual exploitation. And I was reading through this, so that's why I've included. So generally, there is high prevalence of HIV, even though there are programs about use of contraceptive and the issues, etc. But they generally reach us after 18 years of age, because that is considered to be the ideal age after which a person can enter in sexual intercourse. Now you see, uh, when inquired, that the sexual encounter in transgenders is at the average age of 15. And also, you'll find that it is not always by their consent, but there is a lot of sexual violence against them as well. So when it comes to sexual violence, then you cannot say that it is because of lack of awareness. A lot of them are pushed into prostitution. That also breeds this problem of HIV. A lot of them have to take to prostitution to manage their day-to-day living. Then we have already discussed, because of various societal factors, they have high prevalence of mental issues. Now, because of these mental issues, the suicide rate is also high, and they generally take to substance abuse and particularly alcohol. Now, I'm quoting from a report. You need not, because they're not going to ask a question on this. As I've already told you, the question is going to be on issues and schemes related to transgenders, and not on who are those and what are their problems. Then, prevalence of malnutrition, low levels of awareness, family disowning, government not taking care of them, society alienating them. Obviously, malnutrition is also a widespread problem in them. Then there is this idea of gender affirmative therapy, which basically helps people in accepting or basic affirming their gender identity. So if there is a male who identifies as a girl, now this gender affirmative therapy would help them affirm their gender identity, because they identify their gender as that of a girl, of a woman, even though their sex, biological sex, is male. Now, we do not have say avenues of this gender affirmative therapy, and if at all we have, those are private institutions where the cost of that counseling and any kind of gene therapy is very expensive, is very high. Okay, I've not watched the Lakshmi film for that matter. Okay. But if, as you have already suggested, I'll definitely go through the gist of it. Tali. Okay, okay. I'm not much into movies, so but I'll just note this name and I'll just go through the gist of the movie. Now, when you take up other dimension, that is of education, you find that there is a lot of discrimination when it comes to education. And now, again, the data that has been mentioned here, this study on transgenders, this is limited only to NCR and Uttar Pradesh, so it is not a complete study, but it also reflects nicely on how they are being discriminated against when it comes to education. So look at the proportion or the number of people who had no education. They're not getting any education at all. Look at the number. Similarly, studying below 10 standard, again high. Why? Because generally after 10 standard, somehow your gender identity starts becoming more prominent, because you reach the age of puberty and those the gender identity becomes more prominent, and that is when all the problems start happening, because it is out in the open. You are being ridiculed, you would not feel like going to the school, the family might disown you, etc., etc. And similarly, as you go towards higher education, there is a lot of decline. Look at the numbers when it comes to people who are taking up to, or transgenders who are taking up to graduation and post graduation. So that means there is discrimination when it comes to education. So this discrimination can be because of harassment by their teachers, harassment by their classmates, harassment in public, harassment by non-teaching staff, verbal abuse, etc. So all these challenges, one problem is that they will lead to one or the other mental health problem. But also it shows that there is a lot of discrimination when it comes to education. Now also, according to 2011 census, the literacy rate was only 56%, whereas the national average is that of 74%. But remember here that literacy rate, what kind of metrics do we use in literacy rate, right? So uh, it is less than what the basic standard should have been. So basically, when it comes to your indicators of health and education, there is a problem. How can you fix those? We have government initiatives that will come to. But apart from that, when it comes to sexual orientation, let's talk about your section 377. And if you have already covered this, but I think this is something that would have already been covered in your recent lectures, current affair lectures, and also in polity. So section 377, it used to criminalize homosexuality, but then they decriminalize it in your 2018 Navtej Singh Johar case, wherein they decriminalized homosexuality. So before this, people could not have had sexual intercourse with people of the same sex. But now, after 2018, they have decriminalized. So this is basically the timeline of your same-sex marriage. Need not, I don't think I have to go through this. And recently, you see that after your 2018, wherein the Supreme Court said that choice of your partner is a person's fundamental right. It was in context of interreligious marriage, but then uh, there was a petition that same-sex marriage should also be allowed. If it is a fundamental right, then I have a fundamental right to choose the person that I want to. How would sex come into picture? And recently you have seen that how it turned out, what was the judgment, etc. So this is the basic legal journey when it comes to homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Now, coming over to what is the basic government intervention when it comes to your transgenders. So in 2019, this act was passed, which basically talks about various rights of transgenders. Now, what I've done is I've given you the bill here. You can just go through it. It has all the provisions. Now, I'll show you that how can you figure out problems in these bills and acts. Now, this is something that I think, because you are towards the last leg of your preparation, because that's why you have taken up these main subject classes. So you have covered everything. You have been going through current affairs, I believe. Now see, you have to analyze, because it is not always required that you go through the newspaper. When you start analyzing a policy, when you start analyzing anything, you have to be just very careful and observant. So for everything, you just have to see what is going to be the consequence. So for instance, in these draft rules under your Transgender Person Protection of Rights Act 2019, there was this idea of identifying yourself or identifying a self identity of gender. This is one idea under your Transgender Persons Protection of Right, because the first thing is that how do you identify? They do not have any identity, so how do you identify? So they say that you can identify your gender yourself, and you will get a certificate of identity, certificate for your identity. Now, if you have to identify your gender yourself and you get a certificate for it, do you think anyone else is required in that case? Should be required ideally in that case? And the answer is no. Only the authority which provides you that certificate. But when you talk about this transgender certificate, you have to get it from the local magistrate only after, if you are resident for 1 year, and that is not always the case, because people who do not have identity, people who are marginalized, people who are under uh, say who are impoverished, they keep moving from one place to another. Not just that, you have to get a psychologist's report for applying as well. Then again, they talk about making their life better, making the quality of life better, etc. But they do not identify any kind of welfare measures. They do not talk about any kind of reservation or positive discrimination with which they can achieve whatever objectives they have written. Similarly, you have this Gender Inclusion Fund, recently from National Education Policy 2020, which talks about providing education or fund education of people from these marginalized genders. Then also there is a penalty for making a false application. Now, who is going to identify what is a false application, etc.? So these are the kind of discrepancy that you have with respect to your Transgender Protection of Rights 2019 Act. You have a complete analysis here. Now, you see that it is a little old, but this year you have your same-sex marriage in news. You can also, I'm not saying that you can relate it to transgenders, but yes, it is coming from the same gender identity problem or gender identity issue. So they can go on and ask a question on this particular act. So it is better you go through this from PRS. So they have a complete analysis. They talk about all the provisions and they have a complete analysis of all the provisions. Because if we do it in the class, again, it becomes very factual. Apart from this, there are other provisions like Gender Inclusion Fund, as already discussed. Then they are talking about a national portal for transgender persons. It is already there, where they get their digital certificate and identity card for free. Similarly, there are other ways in which they are actually doing this. Go through this link. This covers all the government initiatives meant for transgenders. Why I've given this is, I generally do not mention these links, etc. But now, why I've given this is because for the past 1 year, the same-sex marriage and the issue related to homosexuality and the changing institution of family and marriage is in news. So these become important. Also, you'll find that the government is, uh, because they are homeless, so they have identified the problem of homelessness, and they are talking about providing them shelter. So they have opened up specific shelter for transgenders, etc. So these are various government initiatives. They are here in this document. Till date, till 22, everything is covered. So you need not worry about if there is anything else that you want to read. These will be more than sufficient. Apart from this, if there is something in the current affairs that shows up, you can take up that as well. So there's a question. Sushmita Sen. Okay. Okay. So Yama, you're saying that take this up. So what I've done is the major problems or the major uh, say analysis, whatever was there, I have just summarized it here. That there is issue related to self identity of gender. Then there is issue related to making a false application. then they are talking about making their lives better, but they are not talking about specific welfare measures. These were the three major challenges which have been highlighted in this act. So all you have to do is you just take up this link. I'm not able to copy, but you can just copy this link, take up this link, go through it, and just make very crisp notes. Should not be more than half the page. So just write the provision, write the important provision briefly, and against that provision, just in 2 words or so, write the analysis part so that you remember later. There'll be a provision for penalty for making false application, and you write it there. That's it. That's all you have to do about this particular act, because there are so many acts, etc., that you cannot possibly go through. Trust me on that. There are so many government initiatives for each and every vulnerable section, which is impossible to take up. So all you have to do is you have to take up whatever is there in current affairs. So even though I've given you this link where you have all the initiatives here, but the only thing that you would have to do is you just see that there is this problem of homelessness, and government has this say they are talking about providing shelter. Similarly, they are not getting jobs, so they are talking about gender inclusion fund so that they get education and hence they can get a job. Similarly, they have specific skill development programs. So that's all. You just have to relate it with the problems, and if at all a question is asked, that will be more than sufficient to answer. So do not overdo any vulnerable section. That is my honest opinion. Yes, you will definitely need these policies, etc., for your prelims, but for your mains, they rarely ask a say specific question on a particular scheme, and they'll ask a specific question on a particular scheme only when it is in news, only when it is very important or very new. So Jera is asking, okay, so Jera might not have gone through the. So yes, they had said that you can choose a partner of your choice and you can get married. It is your fundamental right. But recently, the Supreme Court came out with a judgment that they are not going to intervene into the provisions of Special Marriage Act, and they are not going to make any changes in Special Marriage Act so that uh, to they accommodate same-sex marriage. And there are various arguments about this, that it will change the structure and function of family and marriage as an institution. It can become a social problem, so on and so forth. So they have not legalized same-sex marriage. So as of now, as of today, in India, same-sex marriage is prohibited. Same-sex marriage cannot be taken up. Okay. So what we did in the entire discussion for the past 3-4 days is we started with Indian society, basics of Indian society, moved on to various institutions of Indian society, and how these institutions are undergoing change. What are the consequences of these change? What are the forces or factors responsible for this change? But apart from this change, these institutions also maintain continuity. So what are the factors responsible for this continuity? What are the problems that arise out of these institutions or these changes, and how we can fix them? Then we took up specific sectors and specific sections. After we took up our demographic studies, after demographic studies or your population chapter, we move towards women and elderly. What are their specific issues? What are various government initiatives? What can be done, etc., etc. Then we move towards your chapter on poverty, and we discussed what are the ways in which you can measure poverty. What is this recent national multidimensional poverty index? Then what is this vicious cycle of poverty? What are the causes and consequences of poverty? How we can fix this problem? How does poverty relate to population? How does poverty relate to women empowerment, etc.? From here we move towards hunger, that what is this problem of divergence between hunger and poverty? What are the factors that impact hunger? How is India faring when it comes to your global hunger index? And then from hunger, we took up two specific sectors. One is education and the other one is health. We took up these sectors, we analyzed them both in the light of their respective policies. So National Education Policy 2020 and your National Health Policy 2017. We looked into various issues from other reports as well. What are various issues and how the policy plans on fixing those issues. Then from health, we move towards your from education. Sorry, we move towards your NGOs and other civil society organizations, and then we finally took up various issues arising out of implementation and design of various policies. That was the basic flow in which we covered Indian society and justice. And I believe you would have been able to understand, because we have taken up, I don't think that you would have taken up so many questions in any of the classes, right? So we have taken up pretty much every previous year question which was relevant. We have covered all the dimensions. We have say tried to figure out that what the structure has to be, how can we introduce this question in more than one way, because ultimately if you think about that, okay, this is the introduction to this topic that a lot of students do, it is not going to help. So everything has to be in context. So the flow of the answer has to be proper, the content has to be crisp. So we have understood the art of writing answers, and I hope a few, at least a few of you would have written a few answers, at least your weekly tests and your practice questions. If not, it's okay, it's not too late. Please do it now with your revision, because if you do not do it now, later you'll forget. Because the answer writing that we have discussed, the way in which we have discussed, it is not just limited to social issues and justice. Now you should be aware that if there are these statement based questions in other subjects or even direct questions, how you have to maintain the flow and structure of your answer. And the syllabus is completed, but please be a little say observant when you go through current affairs. That's why I've shown you a few questions which look very factual, right? So yes, you need to remember a few facts here and there, and I have already told you which facts to remember and which facts to forget. Now with this and we have answered, I have tried to answer pretty much every question. And if you have still, if you have any doubts, any problems, you can mail to me at hemant.tavar@byju's.com. If you have any suggestions, any feedback, you can still use the same mail. Drop me a mail, so that if there is something, if there is a lacuna, I can improve on it, I can fix that problem. So with this, I think it's time to take your leave. Yeah, so I think we have been taking up guidance. So the approach was to guide you more rather than make you say remember what I've told. The idea was to guide you, to give you direction, to clear your concepts, and that's why that's my idea. So I believe in having a discussion, a discourse, rather than a one-way communication. Right? Even though it is online, I still try to maintain the level of interaction that we do in offline classes. And please let me know if there is anything else. And right now, I don't think I'm in a position to give motivational speech for that matter. I've not been keeping well for the past few days. Okay. Yes, the syllabus, the entire syllabus is done. All the topics that are mentioned in paper 1 and paper 2 are done. Please take a print of the main syllabus and keep it on your desk, because there is a possibility that I might have missed on a couple of topics. I could have easily done that because you did not look at the syllabus at all, right? Okay, so thank you everyone. Thanks for your patience, and please let me know if you have any doubts, any problems. You have my email address with you. Thank you, Ragni. Thank you, Sneha, Aditya. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay, one last thing. This was the last session, so we do not have any class after this. So I think they would have to cancel that class. So there was another session scheduled for today for social issues and justice. It would not be required anymore as we have already covered the syllabus. The entire syllabus, we have taken up questions and everything. Thank you.